We've explored the Greeks through the writings of Sophocles, the tragic playwright, the Sophists, Plato, and we end our journey through Greece with Aristotle. And in many ways, Aristotle is the greatest of the ancient Greek philosophers. And I want you to see that Aristotle's political philosophy, the way that he thinks about justice, is an entire way of seeing the world. And it's a way of seeing the world and a way of thinking about moral reasoning, a way of thinking about political philosophy, a way of thinking about justice that can in fact enrich and illuminate for us our own world. Aristotle comes into the same Greek world that Plato inhabits. And in fact, at the age of 17, Aristotle, who's from the northern stretches of the Greek world, Stagira, comes to Athens to study with Plato at Plato's academy. And he learns there at the feet of the great Athenian philosopher. He would, though, eventually then go off to study on his own. And in fact, Aristotle would spend time as what we would consider a natural scientist. Aristotle spends time studying marine biology. In fact, he studies the life of the oceans itself. And I want you to keep that idea in mind, because truly to understand Aristotle's way of seeing the world, it's important to appreciate that Aristotle looks at nature. He looks at the world and he sees nature. He looks at human society and he sees nature. He looks at human beings and he sees nature. Nature will become the grounds of Aristotle's views about morality. Aristotle then goes on from being an observer of the world to acting as the tutor to a king, or rather a prince, in the northern kingdom of Macedonia, a prince named Alexander, the man who would become the king of Macedon, Alexander the Great. Aristotle served for a time as the tutor to this most important political figure. And there's a deep symbolism there because, in a way, Aristotle is the last of the truly giant Greek philosophers, the most important and the last. And Aristotle lives at a moment of transition. Aristotle still moves during his life throughout the world of the ancient Greek city-states, the polis. This way of life, living in a city, cities that would be no more than 10 to 50,000 people in most cases, what we would think of as small towns, but which were nevertheless the seedbed of political creativity, were nevertheless this environment in which enormous constitutional experimentation would give rise to political strife, but also to a kind of political philosophizing about the best way to live, the best way to organize a constitution, a kind of conversation that had never taken place at this level of richness at any part of human history. And Aristotle lives at a moment of transition because he lives at the end of this age. And indeed, the figure that he tutored, Alexander the Great, would not only become king of Macedon, but would lead Macedon to become the hegemon of the Greek world and indeed beyond. The career of Alexander would forever destroy the independence of the Greek city-state and give rise to an age of empires, when cities would be incorporated into larger sovereign bodies, empires. And it would bring, at least to a slow, the age of enormous political experimentation of the Greek polis. Aristotle, though, would tutor this man, Alexander, who would be responsible for carrying Greek philosophy, Greek language, Greek culture on a worldwide scale. Alexander's conquest would take him to India, all the way down to Egypt, and would spread Greek culture everywhere in his wake. So Aristotle lives at a moment of closure, a moment when the Greek polis is coming to its end. But Aristotle's thought world, his philosophical vocabulary, his way of viewing the world, is still very much a part of the conversations that we've been exploring. The Sophists come to Athens and destabilize traditional beliefs. Some, like Sophocles, would defend tradition as a valid grounds of knowledge. Others, like Plato, would realize the severity of the challenge and would erect grand new systems of knowledge based on human reason. Aristotle is part of those conversations. He's unwilling to accept the relativism of the Sophists. He's unwilling to accept that our moral beliefs are simply subjective, that they're somehow mere convention. Remember the distinction that the Sophists create between nature, physis, and culture, nomos, convention, and objective natural order. This distinction would drive Greek philosophy for nearly a century. And as we've seen, it's a profoundly provocative way of thinking about the world. Plato realizes how challenging it is and tries to salvage a system of morality by grounding it on objective reason alone. And in doing so, Plato is willing to discount the influence of the senses. He's willing to discount the kind of information that we get from observing the world altogether. Aristotle, though, wants to create a philosophical system that can rescue knowledge, that can provide a grounds for moral belief, that says that it's not simply subjective, it's not simply relative, it's not simply your culture. But he wants to do so in a way that grounds that in a system that's defensible, but doesn't rely entirely, as with Plato, on reason alone. Aristotle will try and create a system of knowledge, a system of morality, that synthesizes our observations of the world, in other words, empirical knowledge, and reasoning about the world, logic, and the use of reason. And in fact, Aristotle is the first great systematic thinker about logic. How can we combine our observations of the world into a valid set of inferences about what is true? Aristotle's system of logic would prevail for over a millennium, and that's a measure of how influential his philosophy of knowledge truly was. But it's not as a philosopher of knowledge that Aristotle is most important to us today. Even though Aristotle's reasoning about the nature of morality and the nature of politics equally belongs to the ancient world, it still has things to teach us in the way we think about the morality of justice.